In the Mojave Desert, there's a hole in the ground that used to supply the entire world. For nearly 3 decades, the Mountain Pass mine in California didn't just lead the global rare earth industry, it was the global rare earth industry, producing roughly 70% of the planet's entire supply of the 17 obscure metallic elements that, decades later, would turn out to be essential to almost every piece of advanced technology humanity builds: fighter jets, smartphones, wind turbines, precision-guided missiles, electric vehicle motors. All of it depends on these elements, and for most of the 20th century, the company that controlled the supply was American. Today, China controls somewhere close to 90% of the world's rare earth processing capacity, and the United States, despite owning the very mine that once dominated this industry, is so far behind that experts are now openly debating whether it can ever fully close the gap. This video is the real story of exactly how that happened. Not a clean story about China innovating its way to dominance while America stood still, but a far messier, far more human story about regulatory failure, corporate collapse, a string of genuinely avoidable mistakes spread across more than a decade, and a strategic rival that simply showed up, invested relentlessly, and refused to stop. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this gap exists, why closing it is now projected to take the better part of another decade, even with billions of dollars of fresh investment, and why the timeline behind this story matters far more than the simple, satisfying version usually told about it. Stick around, because the actual history here, the real chain of decisions, is considerably more interesting than the headline version. And if you want more stories that dig past the surface explanation into the documented reality underneath, the subscribe button is right there. Let's start in the Mojave Desert, because you cannot understand how staggering this collapse actually was without first understanding exactly what America once had. Mountain Pass was discovered in 1949, almost by accident, by prospectors who were actually searching for uranium deposits. What they found instead was bastnasite, a rare earth-bearing mineral. And by the early 1950s, the Molybdenum Corporation of America had begun extracting rare earth elements at industrial scale, making Mountain Pass one of the very first large-scale rare earth operations anywhere outside Asia. Through the 1960s and 70s, the mine didn't just compete in the global rare earth market. It defined it, supplying the cerium, lanthanum, neodymium, and praseodymium that powered an entire generation of advancing technology. From the color television sets transforming American living rooms to the early computing systems and military laser systems that depended on these exact materials. Production expanded so dramatically through the 1960s, driven specifically by demand for europium used in color TV screens, that between 1965 and 1995, Mountain Pass supplied the majority of the entire world's rare earth metal consumption. At its peak, responsible for roughly 70% of global supply. For 3 decades, if you wanted rare earth elements anywhere on Earth, there was a very good chance they came from a single mine in the California desert. So what actually happened? Because the popular version of this story usually jumps straight to China's rise, almost skipping past the considerably less flattering reality of America's fall. And that fall is where the real lessons in this story actually live. The unraveling began in the late 1980s and accelerated through the 1990s. And it had almost nothing to do with China doing anything at all yet. It had to do with what was happening inside Mountain Pass itself. The mine relied on a 14-mile underground wastewater pipeline connecting the facility to the Ivanpah Dry Lake, where wastewater was discharged directly onto the lake bed to evaporate, based on the company's own assurances to California regulators that the water being piped was uncontaminated, salty runoff rather than anything hazardous. That assurance turned out to be badly wrong. The pipeline suffered recurring ruptures throughout the 1980s and 90s, and Environmental Protection Agency investigations later found that hundreds of thousands of gallons of waste had spilled from holding ponds and pipeline breaks, including radioactive byproducts generated by the rare earth extraction process itself. The resulting regulatory scrutiny, environmental fines, and mounting compliance costs proved to be the beginning of the end. In 1998, the mine's separation plant, the facility actually responsible for refining raw ore into usable rare earth compounds, ceased production of refined materials entirely, continuing only to produce a lower value concentrate. By 2002, following yet another toxic waste spill, Mountain Pass shut down completely. Here's the detail that should genuinely sting, looking back at it now. The mine didn't reopen afterward, primarily because of China. It stayed closed specifically because, by the early 2000s, Chinese rare earth suppliers had already become cheap and reliable enough that reopening an aging, environmentally troubled American facility no longer made obvious economic sense to the private owners holding the asset. America didn't lose this industry in a single dramatic battle. It walked away from the table first, years before China had built anything resembling the dominant position it holds today, and that single sequencing detail changes the entire meaning of everything that followed. What happened next reads less like corporate history and more like a slow-motion case study in how to lose a strategic industry through sheer mismanagement, one ownership change at a time. Chevron acquired Mountain Pass in 2005 as part of its purchase of Unocal, briefly proposed expanding rare earth production given rising demand, then turned around in 2008 and sold the mine off to a newly formed private company, Molycorp Minerals, for $90 million. Molycorp genuinely tried to revive American rare earth production, sensing real opportunity when China tightened its own export controls in 2010, restricting rare earth exports, specifically as global demand was climbing. Molycorp went public in 2010, raised significant capital, and even acquired Silmet, an Estonian rare metals processing company, attempting to build out a complete vertically integrated supply chain spanning 2 continents. For a brief moment, it genuinely looked like the comeback story might actually work. It didn't. By 2015, Molycorp had declared bankruptcy, undone by a combination of collapsing rare earth prices as Chinese supply flooded back into the market, the company's own over-leveraged balance sheet from its acquisition spree, and, according to later reporting, a chief executive who had previously run Neo Materials, a company with deep operational ties to China, and who oversaw a period during which much of Molycorp's most profitable assets ended up transferred specifically to that Chinese-linked competitor. Whether that was simple bad judgment or something considerably more troubling depends on which account you read, but the practical outcome was identical either way. By 2017, Mountain Pass, the mine that once supplied 70% of the entire world's rare earths, was purchased out of bankruptcy by a new ownership group. And even after that purchase, the raw ore mined from American soil was still being shipped overseas to China for the actual processing and refining. Because by then, the specialized separation technology and infrastructure needed to turn raw rare earth ore into usable industrial materials simply no longer existed at meaningful scale anywhere in the United States. Read that sequence back slowly, because it's worth sitting with. America didn't lose a fair competitive race against a country that out-innovated it. It owned the dominant mine, walked away from it over environmental violations it caused itself, watched a private company's genuine attempt at revival collapse into bankruptcy, and ended up in a position where its own rare earth-bearing rock had to be sent to its principal strategic rival just to become useful. That's not a story about China being unstoppable. That's a story about a 15-year stretch of compounding American mistakes, made one decision at a time, by people who each had what seemed like reasonable justifications in the moment. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, China was building something with a completely different character, patient, deliberate, and explicitly treated as a multi-decade national strategic priority rather than a series of disconnected corporate bets. Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating hard through the 1990s and 2000s, the Chinese government made a sustained top-down decision to invest heavily in both mining and, crucially, the far more technically demanding processing and separation stage of the rare earth supply chain. In 1992, China's paramount leader at the time, Deng Xiaoping, made a statement that would prove prophetic, declaring that the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths, explicitly framing these obscure elements as a strategic resource on par with petroleum, decades before most of the rest of the world fully grasped why that comparison made any sense at all. China's approach succeeded for reasons that have very little to do with any single technological breakthrough, and a great deal to do with a kind of long-horizon, state-backed industrial policy that simply doesn't exist in the same form anywhere in the West. Cheap loans, deliberately loose environmental enforcement, and direct government investment drove production costs so low that foreign competitors, including the very Mountain Pass mine that had once dominated this exact industry, often could not survive against the pricing China's domestic producers could offer. It's worth understanding exactly why rare earth processing specifically, as opposed to simply mining the raw ore, is so difficult to replicate quickly, because that technical reality is the actual foundation of China's leverage. Despite their name, rare earth elements aren't actually rare in the geological sense. They're found in meaningful quantities across the Earth's crust in dozens of countries. What's genuinely difficult, and what China spent decades mastering, is separation. The 17 rare earth elements occur naturally bundled together in ore, chemically similar enough to each other that pulling them apart into individually pure, usable materials requires an exceptionally delicate, multi-stage chemical process involving hundreds of repeated extraction cycles, specialized equipment, and operators with years of accumulated hands-on experience that simply cannot be conjured into existence by writing a check. The heavier rare earths, the ones most critical for high-performance magnets and military applications, are particularly punishing to refine, requiring even more extraction cycles and more specialized expertise than their lighter counterparts. China holds, by a wide margin, the largest number of patents covering exactly this separation technology, and has been progressively tightening export controls on the underlying techniques since at least 2008, meaning the knowledge gap isn't simply a matter of catching up on equipment. It's a matter of catching up on several decades of accumulated, deliberately protected institutional expertise. While American and other Western rare earth operations were closing mines and shuttering processing facilities under the weight of environmental compliance costs, China's industry scaled up continuously, developing deep technical expertise across the entire mine-to-magnet supply chain. Extraction, chemical separation, metal refining, and finally the high-performance magnet manufacturing that represents the most lucrative and most technically demanding step of the entire process. It's worth being honest about the real cost behind that achievement too, because China's dominance didn't simply happen as a clean engineering success story, and pretending otherwise would be a disservice to the people who actually paid the price for it. In Inner Mongolia, the world's largest rare earth mining region, decades of lightly regulated extraction and processing left behind infamous toxic tailings, ponds, and heavily contaminated water supplies. Workers in these facilities have suffered serious documented health consequences from chronic exposure to toxic dust, heavy metals, and naturally radioactive materials that are an unavoidable byproduct of rare earth ore. Western nations, by contrast, imposed strict pollution controls and substantial legal liability on exactly the kind of operations Mountain Pass once ran, controls that significantly raised domestic costs and ultimately formed a major part of why Mountain Pass itself struggled to remain profitable. Markets responded rationally to the prices and rules that actually existed at the time. Production flowed, over years, toward wherever it was cheapest and easiest to operate, even when that ease was substantially the product of deliberate political and regulatory choices in China, rather than any genuine underlying efficiency advantage. China's rare earth dominance, in other words, is better understood as a coercive monopoly sustained by political choice than as a natural monopoly born from simple market forces. And the price for building it was paid largely by Chinese communities and ecosystems that bore the environmental and health consequences nobody in the West had to absorb directly. So where does all of that compounding history actually leave the world right now in 2026, with the consequences no longer theoretical? China today controls approximately 90% of global rare earth processing and separation capacity, roughly 93% of magnet manufacturing, and holds dominant positions in adjacent critical materials as well, including roughly 80% of global tungsten refining capacity. That dominance isn't rooted in resource scarcity either, which is a detail that should genuinely unsettle anyone hoping for a quick fix. China holds only about 35% of the world's known rare earth reserves, meaning the country's real leverage comes almost entirely from its near-total control over the complex, capital-intensive processing stage of the supply chain, the exact technical capability the United States allowed to disappear after Mountain Pass's separation plant went dark in 1998. The practical consequences of that leverage became impossible to ignore throughout 2025 and into 2026. Beijing tightened export controls on a range of rare earth elements, including samarium, dysprosium, and terbium, materials essential for defense systems, electric vehicle motors, and advanced semiconductors, in direct response to American tariff actions. Licensing approval rates for European companies trying to import these materials fell below 25%, and prices for some restricted elements spiked by as much as 6 times their normal level within a matter of months. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, in its own analysis of the crisis, noted that these materials are essential inputs for F-35 fighter jets, Virginia and Columbia-class submarines, Tomahawk missiles, and precision-guided munitions, the literal hardware underpinning American military capability, all dependent on a supply chain effectively controlled by the country. America's own defense establishment now treats as its principal strategic rival. The American response has been genuinely serious in scale, even if it's arriving roughly 2 decades later than it probably should have. In February of 2026, the United States hosted the first ever Critical Minerals Ministerial in Washington, bringing together representatives from 54 nations specifically to confront this exact vulnerability. And the resulting coalition, called FORGE, was explicitly chaired by South Korea and designed to create a preferential trade and investment zone with coordinated price floors for critical minerals. The Department of Defense entered into a direct floor price arrangement with MP Materials, the company that now owns the revived Mountain Pass mine, guaranteeing a price of $110 per kilogram for neodymium praseodymium oxide, along with profit-sharing arrangements, an explicit acknowledgement that private markets alone hadn't been willing to fund the kind of capital-intensive domestic processing capacity the country actually needs. A separate $10 billion public-private initiative called Project Vault, launched specifically to build a strategic critical minerals reserve, explicitly modeled on the long-standing Strategic Petroleum Reserve, designed to stockpile essential raw materials and protect American manufacturers from exactly the kind of supply shock the country experienced throughout 2025. The response hasn't been a purely American story either, and the international dimension matters because it changes the realistic odds of actually closing this gap. The 54-nation Forge coalition itself signals something genuinely different from previous, narrower attempts at diversification. Rather than the United States simply trying to rebuild domestic capacity alone, the current strategy explicitly leans on allied nations with their own processing ambitions and existing industrial bases. Australia, which holds substantial rare earth reserves of its own, signed an $5 billion rare earth partnership with the United States last October, specifically aimed at diversifying American manufacturers' supply sources, alongside separate agreements with Malaysia and Thailand. Washington has also turned toward Central Asia, approving billions of dollars in development finance specifically to help finance critical mineral supply chain security in a region containing some of the world's most significant underdeveloped mineral deposits, alongside renewed attention to logistics corridors running through the Caucasus that could eventually move processed materials toward Western markets without touching Chinese infrastructure at any stage. None of these efforts individually comes close to matching China's existing processing capacity, but taken together, they represent the first genuinely coordinated multi-continent attempt to build an alternative supply chain from mine to magnet, rather than the scattered single-country efforts that defined the previous 15 years of half-hearted American attempts to address this exact vulnerability. And yet, even with all of that fresh investment and political attention, the experts closest to this industry are remarkably consistent in their sober, unglamorous timeline projections, and it's worth taking their estimates seriously. Precisely because none of them have any incentive to sound more pessimistic than the facts actually warrant. Analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies estimate it will take 5 to 7 years to build meaningful alternative processing capacity outside China, with only a 12 to 18-month window available to even begin meaningful diversification before the most acute vulnerabilities compound further. Bloomberg's own reporting, drawing on projections from 3 separate critical mineral consultancies, including McKinsey and CRU Group, suggests that for the most strategically critical heavy rare earths, the elements essential for high-performance magnets and the most sensitive military technologies, China's dominance will likely persist until at least the mid-2030s, with countries outside China still expected to meet less than a fifth of global demand for elements like dysprosium and terbium even by 2035. Marina Yue Zhang, an associate professor at the University of Technology Sydney who specializes in Chinese industrial policy, points to an even more basic structural problem underneath the processing gap. The United States currently produces only about 1/15 the number of mining-related graduates that the scale of this challenge actually requires, meaning even unlimited capital can't fully solve a shortage of the specialized human expertise this industry depends on. This is precisely where the title of this video earns its place, and it's worth being completely transparent about exactly what it's pointing toward. The comparison between America's lost decade, or more accurately, several lost decades, stretching from the late 1980s environmental violations through the 2015 Molycorp bankruptcy and China's comparatively fast, brutally consistent 2-decade build-out, isn't a claim about one single clean 2-year sprint defeating one single clean 10-year effort. It's a claim about 2 fundamentally different relationships with time itself. China treated rare earth dominance as a multi-generational strategic project starting in the 1980s and never wavered from that commitment regardless of short-term cost or political inconvenience. America, across the same broad window, treated its own dominant position as a private commercial asset, one that got abandoned the moment it became environmentally inconvenient, then resurrected and killed again through a sequence of corporate bankruptcies and ownership changes, never once benefiting from the kind of sustained, decades-long national commitment China brought to the exact same problem. The real gap here isn't measured cleanly in years at all. It's measured in the fundamental difference between sustained strategic patience and a string of short-term decisions that each made sense individually but compounded, over time, into a complete loss of an entire strategic industry. So where does this actually leave the rest of us, watching this unfold in real time from outside either government's strategic planning rooms? The gap is real. It's currently costing American manufacturers and the broader Western defense and technology industries enormous sums through price spikes and supply disruptions. And by the most credible independent projections available, it isn't closing on anything resembling a fast timeline, regardless of how much fresh political will and fresh capital gets thrown at the problem starting now. But the gap also isn't permanent, isn't rooted in any insurmountable Chinese technological advantage that can never be replicated, and is now attracting a level of sustained government attention, international coordination, and serious capital investment that simply didn't exist a decade ago, back when Molycorp was quietly going bankrupt with almost nobody outside the industry paying close attention. There's a meaningful difference, worth naming directly, between this current moment and every previous American attempt to address this exact vulnerability. Molycorp's 2010s revival effort was fundamentally a private commercial bet, dependent entirely on rare earth prices staying high enough for long enough to justify the capital investment with no government backstop in place when prices inevitably fell and the bet went bad. The current effort, by contrast, includes direct government price floors, Defense Department procurement guarantees, and a formal multi-decade strategic reserve, the exact kind of durable, politically insulated commitment that a purely private company could never offer its own investors. Whether that structural difference proves sufficient to survive a full presidential administration change, a future commodity price crash, or simply the slow erosion of political attention, once the current crisis fades from headlines, is a genuinely open question that nobody, including the officials currently building these programs, can answer with full confidence today. Whether that attention proves to be another short-lived commercial cycle, the kind America has already lived through once with this exact industry, or genuinely becomes the multi-decade strategic commitment the problem actually requires, is the question that will define whether this story ends in a true American comeback or simply repeats its own history one more time, a decade or two from now, with a slightly different cast of companies going bankrupt along the way. If you want to keep tracking exactly how this race actually plays out, whether Mountain Pass and the broader American critical minerals push genuinely closes this gap or simply slows its growth, this channel exists specifically to follow stories like this one all the way through rather than just covering the crisis once and moving on. Go ahead and subscribe now, because the next 5 to 7 years are going to tell us an enormous amount about whether this particular lesson actually got learned. Here's the question I want to leave you with, because I think it's the one that actually matters once you understand the full, messy history rather than just the simplified headline version. If the real story here isn't China being unstoppable, but America repeatedly choosing short-term commercial logic over long-term strategic patience, again and again, across multiple decades and multiple corporate owners, what actually makes you confident the current wave of investment, the critical minerals ministerial, the strategic reserve, the price floor guarantees, breaks that exact pattern rather than becoming just the latest chapter in it? Is 5 to 7 years of sustained bipartisan commitment something the American political and corporate system can actually deliver this time? Or does the next change in administration, the next commodity price swing, the next bankruptcy filing simply restart the entire cycle one more time? Tell me where you land in the comments, because I think the honest answer says less about geology or technology and more about whether either country's political system is actually built for the kind of patience this problem genuinely requires. And if you want to find out how this actually resolves in real time as the next several years of investment either pay off or quietly stall out, make sure you're subscribed, because this is one of the defining industrial stories of the decade, and it's still being written.